And for those of you who don't know, my name is Troy Fears. I'm Executive Director at Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center, located in Terre Haute, Indiana. And we are very excited and happy to have Julie Sondhelm with us tonight. Julie is a licensed clinical social worker and is the clinical director of Jewish Family Services in Indianapolis. She has been very helpful to me and folks at Candles in the last couple of years that I've been at Candles, but she also is very helpful and supportive to local Holocaust survivors in Indianapolis. And so does a lot of work obviously there, and is part of the Holocaust Speakers Bureau. And we are fortunate to have her tonight speaking about her grandfather and his story, which I have not heard before. So I'm excited to hear that. And Julie, I know you have a mother of 4 and you're very active in the community. And so I know you have busy plans. I know you're at the office right now. And so we're going to let you go ahead and kick it off, and we'll get going. If anybody has questions while Julie's speaking, if you could just put it in the Q&A or in the chat feature, and we will ask them at the end of Julie's presentation. So Julie, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Candles for inviting me. It's my first time speaking, not being able to see my audience, but I am very grateful for you for taking the time to listen to my grandfather's story. I'm able to be here today because my grandfather was a survivor of the Holocaust. And it's my honor to share my story, to share his story with all of you. I speak on a pretty regular basis to different school groups, adult groups, about his story. And he actually, while he was alive, was also a speaker.
Julie, I don't know if you can, we see your screen, but there's a little box on the top left that says, it's kind of covering your PowerPoint right now. There's a dismiss and a dismiss all.
Ah.
I don't know, we see that, there we go.
Okay, my notifications.
Now we see the whole PowerPoint.
This was my grandfather. His name was Alphonse Katz, but he liked to be called Al. He was a very lively, fun, spirited person. Once you met him, you would never forget him. He was full of life and energy. He was passionate about his family, about his Jewish identity, about his love for the United States, the country that sheltered him after his experiences in the war and in the Holocaust. He was passionate about many things, really. And one of the things he really cared about was people knowing what happened to him. He believed in the promise of never again. And he really pushed himself to tell of his experiences so no one could forget the Holocaust. When he was younger, he really didn't talk much about his experiences. I was very close with my grandfather, and I was very interested to know, his history, where he was from, where was his family, why there were all these people that I had never met, and why, if I would ask him questions about his family, why would he cry and become emotional? So I spent a lot of time as a young person talking to him, asking questions, listening. These are my 4 children. I love to show this picture because they're here, and I'm here because he survived. And my grandfather really believed in a better world for them and for all of us. As a speaker about the Holocaust, he felt that it was important that there were many lessons to be learned from the experiences that he had, and that it was important that that history would never be denied. I apologize, I'm in my office, and if somebody rings the door at the front, it will ring. There's not much I can do about that. So I apologize.
Quite all right.
I think I probably I became a social worker because of growing up with him, how he loved to help other people, to connect with other people, learn about them. And I also felt that call to connect, to help others. And today I work within the Jewish community. I work with our local Holocaust survivors, as well as others in the Jewish community, to provide any assistance that I can. When we talk about the Holocaust, really, no matter what age group I'm speaking to, it's very difficult to even comprehend the expansive nature and the devastation of what happened. When I talk to young people, I spend a lot of time really talking about how systematic, how state-sponsored persecution was used to kill 6 million Jews, as well as many other millions, including others that were considered racially inferior, political opponents, individuals who had a different sexual identity, disabled individuals. And I also like to have us kind of think about the fact that, what does that number 6 million mean? It's hard to even understand a number that large. And I compare it to the population of the state of Indiana, which is a little bit more than 6 million. And if we think about the idea of every man, woman, and child in the state of Indiana gone in a very short period of time. And that really was the impact. I often ask groups, what's important in your life? And I ask them to provide me ideas. And generally they're pretty consistent. Almost everyone mentions family, their friends, maybe their education, the opportunity to have fun activities, sports, the opportunity to exercise religion or to not exercise religion, their home, their community, other things that build your life and build your enjoyment. And what of these things could you live without? Sometimes, particularly if I'm talking to school groups, they'll talk about, well, I could give up my sports, I could give up school, but my grandfather lost all of these, as did the other victims of the Holocaust. Life before the war in Europe, Jews were very integrated into European culture. They, in large numbers, they fully participated in society as they were able to. In Germany alone, there were more than 500,000 Jewish people. You can see, I don't know if you can read the numbers, if it's too small, but 3 million Jews in Poland. In the Soviet Union, 2.5 million. In Romania, 1 million. All over Europe, Jewish communities were thriving and growing. My grandfather was born in Germany, so really where the seeds of the Holocaust were sown and carried out. He was born in Paderborn. It was a small town, and he in rural Germany. This is the only picture that we have of my grandfather's family. You can see his mother and father, his older brother, Erwin, his older sister, Erngard, his younger sister, Ruth. He also had a younger brother who was born later and isn't in the picture. He had a happy childhood. He said, he would tell me, I was like every other kid. I played soccer, I rode my bike, I went to school, I had lots of friends. His father was a cattle merchant, and he was a pretty successful businessman and well-known in Paderborn. He was highly decorated as a veteran of World War II, or World War I, I'm sorry. And his mom was a homemaker. He had a nice, happy life. And then everything changed. Really, the history of the Holocaust is intertwined with what happened to individuals like my grandfather. It was a step-by-step process. It wasn't, if we think about 12 years between 1933 to 1945, where really the government, the courts, the school systems, media, culture, all were utilized to dehumanize groups of people and to enable the conditions that led to extermination of millions of human beings. In January 1933, Hitler came to power, and he immediately invoked an act giving himself major control of the government under the premise that, Germany was suffering after World War I, people were suffering, and the economy and the country in general, that he would be able, if he had a lot of control of the government, he would be able to turn that trajectory around. 3 months later, the first concentration camp, Dachau, was built. It was initially built for political prisoners. Sometimes when I talk to kids to explain what this means, I'll tell them, imagine if one political party in this country created a camp to put their political opponents inside and to keep them confined. It's the same concept. Right away, the Nazi Party started all kinds of efforts against the Jewish people, boycott of their businesses. There was a big emphasis on genetic and racial difference and inferiority. Jewish people were blamed for the problems in Germany. The concept of a race war was promoted. They actually began forced sterilization of mixed race children. And as I said before, they utilized all their resources to implement and integrate racist ideology throughout society. Jews were excluded from many professions. They were no longer able to go to school past the age of 14. In 1933, my grandfather was 13. He had a dream to become a doctor. And he knew that in another year, he would no longer be able to go to school, and that dream was out of reach for him forever. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws really made racial separation the law. And things were, for my grandfather, things were really, and his family, things were really worsening in the town that they lived in. And they made the decision to flee to Hanover, which was a larger town. They thought if they were in a bigger city, they might be less visible as Jewish people. And a neighbor, actually, a Christian neighbor, came and warned them that there was going to be an attack on the Jews in Paderborn that night. So they just gathered their belongings and fled in the middle of the night to Hanover. Again, hoping to be less visible, less recognizable as Jews in a bigger city. step by step, Jews were separated from, and other groups were separated from the rest of society, unable to attend school, to work in their professions, to socialize with others. They were marked with identity stars. He and his family were forced to work on the streetcars and the rail in Hanover. You know, they were not accustomed to physical labor, but they were forced to do so. During this period, my grandfather's older brother escaped Germany and made it to the United States. And my grandfather really wanted to leave to go to Israel, but his father had already lost one son in his mind who escaped to the United States. And he said, no, we're going to stay together. Germany is a great country. It's going to get better. This can't continue. He was a very proud German. He served, in the war for the German army. And he just could not accept or believe that what was happening. In 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, all over Germany, there were coordinated nights of violence, businesses burned, people killed, 30,000 Jews were taken to concentration camps. On that night, my grandfather saw his father beaten in front of him in the street and taken away. They didn't know for quite a while what had happened to him. Eventually, they were able to get him back out. They bribed some officials, and he was released. But at that point, they realized that they had to get out of Germany, but it was too late. They couldn't. My grandfather's father kept going to the U.S. Embassy, but there were SS soldiers that guarded the front, and he couldn't get past them to go inside. So they were unable to leave. My grandfather was the kind of person who, imagine me as a kid sitting at the kitchen table. He's made me breakfast, and I'm like, Grandpa, tell me what happened to you. And it's painful for him. It's not comfortable for him. It took him time over the years to learn to speak about his story. He became a speaker later in his life. So he liked to emphasize to me the positives. He liked to tell me the parts of it, how he figured out ways to survive, how he figured out how can I say, like the silver lining in a impossible situation. So after Kristallnacht, his father was taken away, and in the morning, he was wandering kind of the city, and he saw the great synagogue was basically rubble, had been destroyed, and he was searching through the rubble, and he found a Torah, which I don't know how many of the listeners are Jewish or familiar with that, but the Torah is our sacred text. And it is, the physical object is also sacred. It is treated as a sacred thing. It's housed in a beautiful cover and in a beautiful case. It's only held with the greatest of respect. It's only touched in the way to make it extremely sacred. And he found that Torah under the rubble, and it was such a heartening thing to him to be able to retrieve that and to give it to the elders of the synagogue. He felt that he somehow had reclaimed something from this terrible night. My grandfather would often say to me that no one could believe what was happening, that it just wasn't real. It just was so hard to accept that an educated culture society that you were a part of could turn on you, and that people could behave this way. He'd never been exposed to violence or death, and it was around him now everywhere. He really, he and his family, particularly his father, had a difficult time coming to terms with it. In 1941, the family was forced to leave Germany and they were sent to the Riga ghetto. That trip was 6 days and they were forced into cattle cars, train cars that were designed for cattle, not for human beings, with no facilities, whatever they had with them, little food. Some people had to stand for the majority of the time. And when they arrived in Riga, in the ghetto, there was barbed wire and soldiers guarding, and they were told, you 3 families, you go into this house, which was designed for maybe one small family. And when they went in the house, they could see that other people had been there. Maybe the coals were still hot in the fireplace. There was still food on the tables. There were belongings. Where did those people go? What happened to them? No one really knew. My grandfather found out later that the Jews from Riga, Latvia, had been all taken out of the ghetto. They all were slaughtered, and then the German Jews were moved in. While my grandfather's family stayed and remained in the ghetto, my grandfather was shipped out to work. He was in 1942, he was 22 years old. So he was one of the younger, stronger men. And he was sent with a group of 1,000 men out to march across the ice to this other location where they were there to build essentially camps for other Jews. They were forced to build those. And my grandfather, to him, this was a very, very shocking environment, even worse than anything he had ever been in before. They had them sleeping in barracks that were made for apples. So like there was shelving for apple storage, and human beings, young men, were forced to sleep in them. My grandfather had this idea that he wanted to get as far away from the Nazis as he could. So he would sleep on the top bunk. And in his mind, that created some kind of physical separation from them. But all night, there was a lot of snow on the roof, and the snow would melt and he would be wet, and then it would freeze. And, it was terrible conditions, but he felt that was his way of protecting himself. He would, out of the 1,000 men that were marched across the frozen ice to Southbills, only 100 returned. The conditions were so terrible. He would talk about being forced to work with 1 watery cup of soup a day, maybe a slice of potato bread. He saw men his age dying of disease, starvation, being killed. One day his entire unit went out and he didn't go because he wasn't feeling well that day. He was sick. None of them returned. What happened to them? He didn't know. He assumed they were all killed. He saw young men his age losing their fingers and toes to frostbite, being beaten, and even worse to him, he saw people losing their sense of hope. He was allowed to come back once to the Riga ghetto. The slide I showed previously, this is a picture that I found about the ghetto. It's not a picture of my grandfather, but my grandfather would always tell me the story that he was able to go back once to visit his family in the ghetto, and his younger brother Werner was standing on the other side of the barbed wire fence, and he was eating a piece of bread. And I guess my grandfather looked so sick and thin and weak from his time in slave labor that his younger brother just wordlessly handed him his crust of bread. And my grandfather would always stop then and cry and say that that was the last time he ever saw his brother. In the remaining years of the war, my grandfather was moved from camp to camp, doing all different kinds of labor. He eventually ended up in Dachau in Germany. When he got to Dachau, there were, even towards the end of the war, the Germans were very committed. When they knew they were going to lose, the Nazi Party was very committed to continuing to kill Jews and their other prisoners. And many of the camps became very crammed with people, and Dachau was so full. My grandfather was in something called an out camp, so a camp that was outside the main concentration camp. It was difficult for him to go into detail with me about this time. He would tell me, he told me once that he met a doctor from his town, from Paderborn, in one of the camps that he was in. And he said that the doctor looked at him and just said, "We're never getting out of here." And he said his eyes were just completely blank. And then the doctor ran into the electric fence. It was very important to my grandfather, as I said before, that I believed and knew his stories of survival. At this point, he wasn't a human being anymore. He wasn't treated as a human being anymore. He didn't have a name. He had a number. He didn't have his family. He didn't have an identity. He found out when he was in the camps that the entire Riga ghetto was liquidated. That was the word that was used for the murder of every man, woman, and child, including his family, his mother, his father, his younger brother. His younger sister actually survived, which he didn't find out till the end of the war. She had gone to a camp. She was not in the ghetto at that time. His older sister had attempted to shelter in Denmark. She had gotten married there to a Danish officer who was also Jewish, but she was sent to the camps. She had just had a new baby, and she, her husband, and the new baby were killed on arrival. But he always emphasized to me his stories of survival. He loved to tell a story about how he, one day, an SS soldier came to the camp. They gathered all the men together, and they said, "Who knows how to drive a train?" And everybody's looking around, and my grandfather raised his hand. He had no idea how to drive a train. But in his mind, he's like, "It will get me out of the camp." So the SS soldier took him on the train and said, "Okay, show me how to drive the train." And there was a engineer there. And my grandfather thought quickly and said, "This is an old-fashioned train. Where I come from in Germany, it's high quality and modern trains. The engineer is going to have to show me how to do it." So in this way, my grandfather became the train conductor, and he had, sometimes he could sneak food, sometimes the train was transporting food, and sometimes he could throw food over the fence. If there were not soldiers watching and the prisoners were standing by the fence and he was going by, he would throw food to other prisoners. It was one way that he felt that he could retain some piece of his humanity. he liked to tell me how he would, there was a lot of disease and filth, and inability for like just normal human hygiene. So he would get up in the middle of the night and sneak out of the camp and roll in the snow, because he thought that could kill some of the lice that were making, people sick. And then in that way, he would be able to also to survive. This was my grandfather's number. He was never tattooed because he was in part of the out camp. But somehow he kept this. We've all seen pictures of the devastation, the starvation, the inhuman conditions. It's almost too hard to understand. At the end of the war, as I said, the Nazis were determined to keep the prisoners, to kill as many as they could, and to not let go of them, even when they could hear American bombers coming close and they knew that the war was lost. They started to march anybody that could walk out of Dachau. And my grandfather was on that march. He said to me that this was a point where he truly felt that he might lose hope. He truly began to despair that he would survive. But as he was marching and walking, he looked around and he saw an SS soldier, a corporal. And he kept repeating to himself the man's name. And he said, I'm going to survive this. And when I get out, I'm going to remember this corporal's name, and I'm going to remember what happened, and I'm going to make sure no one else will ever forget. He was fortunate enough to be liberated by Americans in early May 1945 on this march out of Dachau. After the war, my grandfather went back to Hanover. He was in a hospital for a while, recovering. In the hospital, he found out it was kind of a makeshift tent hospital that were all over Europe. He found his younger sister had survived also, and I already mentioned his older brother was already in the United States. He would tell me about this time just very quietly and sadly. There was nothing left for me in Europe but ashes. He felt he just could not stay there, and he decided to come to the United States. You have to know my grandfather to really maybe feel the look in his eyes from this picture. What I see when knowing my grandfather at the point of life that all my life, until he passed away. He passed away the day before he turned 90. I mean, such a lively person, always interested to meet people, converse. He did not hold on to bitterness. He was obviously hurt and sad and I'm sure angry in some part of himself, but he had friends of every background and every color throughout his life, including German friends. He didn't blame people who were not responsible, and he didn't hold on to anger, bitterness. He really focused on building a life for himself. He came to the United States. He raised a family. He became a business owner. one of his early jobs in the United States was at selling insurance to railroad men. He started out in New York. He landed in New York. He didn't like New York, and he came here. He had Indianapolis. He had some extended family that was here, and he started off selling insurance to railroad men in rural Indiana. And he would tell me, he said, can you imagine, like, I'm in places where there's signs on the door saying no Jews and blacks allowed. And here I am with a big, thick German accent after World War II, trying to sell railroad men insurance. But he did it. He did it. He found a way to connect. He saw the plight of African Americans in this country. He felt very strongly about it. And he joined the NAACP in the 50s because he said, I just left Germany because of inhumanity. I can't let that take place in this amazing country. This is a picture that was taken of my grandfather. He was interviewed from time to time about his experience in the Holocaust. As I said, he was a speaker as well. What he really wanted most for me to know, and what he would want all of you to know from the retelling of the story, is what helped him survive. He always emphasized to me, first and foremost, that he held on to his faith, specifically for him, God and Judaism, and also just his general faith and his ability to surmount any obstacle. He did everything he could to try to hold on to his belief that he would survive. He told me that in the camps on Yom Kippur, which is one of our holiest days of atonement, and you're expected to fast for 26 hours and make amends to other people, to God, ask for forgiveness for the coming year. And even in the camps, while he was starving on Yom Kippur, he would not eat. He would hold his ration for the next day. Because he felt that he was still a person, a human being, a Jewish person. And he would tell me there's always hope, no matter how bleak things appeared. He really believed in the power of us as individuals to make change in our world, and our responsibility to do everything that we can. I know he would want me to leave you with these parting challenges: to protect our human rights and those of others by speaking up against injustice, by paying attention to how we speak about other people, to embrace our differences and our similarities, to remember his story and consider telling your family story, whatever that may be. There may be someone who could learn something or benefit from hearing of the experience. And to truly make never again from this ideal concept into reality. I thank you so much for listening today, for the opportunity to speak to you. It's my honor to be able to share this, and I feel my responsibility. If there's any questions, I'm happy to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julie. And yes, as you just mentioned, if there are any questions, people can feel free to type them in either the chat box or the Q&A box down at the bottom, and we will make sure to ask those questions. That's a fascinating story, and I have quite a few questions myself. I don't know if you knew this, Julie. Obviously, Eva Kor started Candles Holocaust Museum about 28 years ago, but her husband Mickey was in the Riga ghetto as well. I think he was maybe a little before your grandfather was, maybe like 1939, 1940 area. But I thought that was fascinating. But one question that that I have, you touched on so many things that that we talk about at the museum, and one is, asking, when we talk to students especially, is asking them, or telling them to ask their parents, their grandparents, to tell their stories. And you had mentioned that your grandfather didn't necessarily like to talk about it at the beginning, but was he more open to talking about it as the years went on, as you got older, or to telling his story?
Yeah, I mean, it really was the Holocaust deniers that motivated him. When he realized, I don't know if it was in the 1970s or 1980s, I'm not sure, but when he realized, when he heard that there were people who were denying the Holocaust ever happened, that's when he really felt that he had to start. He didn't start off as a speaker, that was later on in his life, but he started at least acknowledging it more within the family and talking about it with friends and talking about with other people. And then my grandfather was my person. If we can have one person, he was my person. So I spent a lot of time with him, and I wanted to understand him, and I wanted to understand what happened to him. I went to a conference because I work with Holocaust survivors, and I heard another survivor speak, and she explained the way that it feels when you are in the family that has been devastated by some type of genocide or catastrophe similar to the Holocaust. She said, imagine, people that have picture frames in their houses of all their family, but all your picture frames are empty. And every birthday party and every holiday, you don't have the chain, you don't have the generations. The chain was cut. The line of the generations was cut. One thing that I never asked my grandfather was, while he was alive, and I wish I had, was what happened. I never heard him talk about grandparents or extended family. I had a chance to talk to his sister, his younger sister, who also survived after he had passed, and to ask her some questions to kind of fill in gaps while I was working on putting together my presentation. And she said to me, they had many aunts, uncles, cousins, and so many of those family members were killed. And she said we had a full live family. And then, it was essentially just him. I'm an only child. I'm an only grandchild. So it's also important to me that I have my 4 children that continue that chain of family and tradition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Couple questions from some of our viewers, and I'm not sure which came first, but I'll ask them both. One is, where did your grandfather meet your grandmother, and was that in the United States? And then basically, how did your grandfather end up in the United States is the other question.
I don't know that much. I'll answer this second question first. I don't know that much about how he got here, but there were after the war, different countries issued visas, for Holocaust survivors and other victims of the war. And so he got permission to come here. Somehow he got a visa to come here as he probably came as a refugee status, which is a quicker path to lead to citizenship. When you come as a refugee, you have a pathway to citizenship. Where did he meet my grandmother? He met my grandmother here in Indianapolis, actually at a Purim ball. He loved to tell me stories. My grandmother died when I was 6 or 7. But that was like, he had girlfriends, but she was the love of his life, and he loved to tell me stories about, their relationship. And they met at a Purim ball, and he saw her and he decided that's it. I don't know if you know much, there was something about Jewish culture at the time, but there was kind of a divide between Ashkenazic Jews and Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews are Jews that originally their origin is like Spanish or Middle Eastern, and then Ashkenaz Jews is more like Eastern European. So there was some kind of differential in terms of the Ashkenazic Jews, and particularly German Jews, viewed as somehow a higher class or more preferable. So it was a big deal that he was marrying somebody that was Sephardic, and there was a whole drama with that. So they had a very interesting love story. But
Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah, you had mentioned earlier about your grandfather finding maybe the Torah scroll that he saved. Do you know, did he keep that? Is it still around? Do you know anything about that part of the
he
story?
gave it to the elders of the synagogue.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, I don't know how he kept what he kept. He kept a tiny book, like prayer book. He had that picture of his family. I don't know how he managed to do that. I find it remarkable that he was able to keep anything, but
And I found it interesting that he mentioned, spoke up to said he knew how to drive the train, right? But then he doesn't necessarily know how to do it. But then he would go on, you said, to sell, was it insurance to train people
I
on
never
the
thought
railroad?
about that. I never,
I thought that was an interesting connection.
yeah, I never thought of that. He ended up opening up his own insurance agency eventually.
Oh, okay.
He worked for a company, selling it to the railroadmen, and eventually he opened up his own insurance company.
And then another question from one of our viewers, and I can say, Eva Kors didn't tell her story until the 1978 TV miniseries about the Holocaust that came out. Do you know if your grandfather had was that miniseries? You mentioned the Holocaust deniers kind of bringing him to tell his story, but did that miniseries, did that have any effect on him?
I don't know. He never mentioned that specifically. I mean, I think the 70s and 80s started that whole conversation about the Holocaust more than previously. So I think a lot of survivors, the ones that were open to talking about it, it brought more out. It brought them out more. Not everybody reacted that way. I mean, I recently met a woman who found out as an adult, had no idea she was Jewish, had no idea that her parents were Holocaust survivors. They were so traumatized from their war experiences that they just wanted to hide here in that way, to hide their identity. And she didn't find out till she was an adult. Everybody reacted, we don't know what we would do under the crucible of such pressure and trauma. So at this thing, it's important not to judge and to support, people in their different way of processing it.
It's funny you mentioned that, and it's kind of going off topic, and I apologize, but you mentioned hiding it, the fact that maybe they're Jewish, or even wanting to talk about the Holocaust. But in your line of work today, do you with the rise of anti-Semitism that is going on in our country and around the world, do you see that? And the reason I had a conversation just the other day with a person who was saying that they sometimes they're not open about being Jewish because they're afraid of what others may say or do towards them. And I didn't know, again, in your line of work, are you seeing a lot of that? Do you see people who are afraid to say that they're Jewish? And
I mean,
don't
I'm sure there are people. I know that people are stressed. I know that it's re-traumatizing for people who've had war experiences or other, discriminatory and prejudicial experiences based on being Jewish. I mean, I can tell you for myself personally, my son right now is backpacking through Europe. He's getting ready to start medical school, which is, when I found out he got in, I cried. And the first thing I said was, Grandpa would be so happy, because he wanted to be a doctor. He didn't get the chance. And now to know that his future generations have kind of reclaimed that. Besides that, he went to Dachau because he was in Germany. And I said, you really need to go. If you can get there, go. So he went. But I told him, I said, don't wear your Jewish star. You don't need any jewelry in Europe. You don't need to wear it. And that's a sign of there's many other populations besides Jewish people that sadly have to tell their children to protect them, behave differently, conceal something, be vigilant of something. And that's the world that we live in. And it's really unfortunate. It doesn't make me happy, but I wanted my son to be safe. And I didn't feel that was safe.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. It is unfortunately the world that we live in, and
Yeah,
I'm
sadly.
sure. Yeah, it is, and it's. But I'm sure, as you mentioned, that your grandfather would be incredibly proud and happy of not just your grandson going to medical school, which is a huge accomplishment, but also of yourself for telling his story and keeping that story out there and letting folks like us be able to hear it and talk about it is I'm sure he's very, very proud.
Thank you.
So thank you, Julie. Our time is almost up here, and it was a great presentation. And I want to thank everybody who's listening, either live or via the recording. This will be our Candles last speaker series for this spring. We saved the best for last, Julie. I don't know if you knew that, but
Thank you.
we did. We'll take a break as we head to Poland in June, and over the summer months we'll start back up in August or September. So be looking on the Candles social media pages and on our website to get the latest information. And so Julie, again, on behalf of Candles, and thank you again for telling your grandfather's story. We do appreciate it. And we wish everyone a good night, and we will talk to everybody soon. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you for listening.